Today, I hope to share with you my experience and how I've learned how crowdsourcing and citizen science are really force multipliers for the emergency management community. First, I'm going to share with you a story of how I was a victim, or survivor rather, of a disaster and how I used social media in response to it, as well as my journey over the last 15 years, starting with my interdisciplinary PhD looking at this and how that evolved into a postdoc fellowship at US Geological Survey that then allowed me to create a position that did not exist, innovation specialist, and then also my journey in helping to initiate the FEMA crowdsourcing unit. So in January 2009, I was told I had to evacuate from the house I lived in Boulder, Colorado. It was the old stage fire, and in some ways I was, I guess, redefining the graduate experience. It was really applying what I was starting to see in the use of social media. So first, one of the things that we've learned is establish the hashtag for the event. So I started to use hashtag #BoulderFire. And ultimately, what I was doing was just finding information online from news sources. I loved finding video footage, especially from helicopters, and trying to explain that information in a tweet format and just pushing it out as fast as I could. I also went to the press conference and thought I could get information about my own area where I lived, Crestview, and then also share other information in a tweet format. So what I found was, in the reactions to my tweets after the event, which really only lasted for about 24 hours, and luckily only burned open space, I learned that it did provide informative information, updates, much more quickly than traditional media. And so it was really interesting when I came across the Denver Channel News article that I was interviewed for, but also realized that it read from a Boulder police spokesperson that my information was, in some cases, much quicker than law enforcement's. Now, this is in part because what I was doing was just curating information I was finding online. And because Twitter makes it so easy for people to get these real-time updates really quickly, much faster than typical media, that's what makes it faster. I began my interdisciplinary PhD program in 2005, just a couple days before Hurricane Katrina hit. And it was a really unique program in looking at the use of emerging technology in disasters. I had a real great opportunity to work with Professor Laisha Palin. I was her first PhD student. And it was a really unique opportunity in how she really had the forward thinking in seeing how emerging technologies were going to be used in crises back in 2005. So in 2007, we wrote 3 different papers where crowdsourcing was not yet a buzzword, but we were anticipating that use of information communication technology and public participation in disasters. There was a lot of online forum use happening, and what we then evolved into using this term crisis informatics to explain this area of work. So generally speaking, crowdsourcing is a practice of engaging and obtaining the needs and services, ideas, content from a large group of people or organizations, particularly online is what we're seeing more and why it's more of a buzzword these days. I also want to explain citizen science, because sometimes crowdsourcing seems to be a more common term. But citizen science is basically a form of open collaboration where we engage folks in any part of the scientific process. So we can have folks engage in the collection of data, taking a photo, for example, or analyzing data, analyzing images, which is something I'll share later, or processing information. It's any part of that scientific process. So before I show you and explain different examples of projects I've worked on, I want to start with some misconceptions, because I think people always mention these things. People think crowdsourcing means social media monitoring, aka social listening. But really, crowdsourcing is about actively engaging people in a certain task, sometimes a very specific micro task. And it's a two-way feedback loop where it's beyond just public outreach. It's really engaging folks in a meaningful way. Also, people think, oh, how can you trust social media or data from the public? Well, for one, data from the public is often more timely and it can be validated in different ways, whether it be through photos or many people actually mentioning the same thing. Also, many official agencies are actually using social media, including FEMA, including USGS. They're using it because it's a much more easy and quick way to get information out in real time. Another misconception is people think that crowdsourced data is not accurate or vetted or high quality. But what I would argue is that I think we assume that data from official channels is actually outdated sometimes. It takes longer. It's not always as accurate. And crowdsourcing projects actually are integrating verification and validation protocols into their projects. Also, crowdsourced data is often leveraging official sources. So some of our digital volunteers that I'll mention actually mention official sources, and they're just using social media as a way to push out information more quickly. So one of the first disasters that our research group, Connective IT, also known as Project EPIC, first responded to was the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007. So a week after the shooting, we went to the campus and talked to students and teachers about how they learned about the shooting as it was happening. We wanted to understand what technologies were people using at the time. And what we learned was that instant messaging was one particular way in which people just knew they were okay or not, just if they were online. They didn't have to post anything, but if their sign was on or not idle. Also, Wikipedia was used in terms of updating the Virginia Tech shooting article over a short period of time and understanding what's happening and who were those that were directly affected. And then Facebook was also a place where people were starting to congregate through groups in "Are you okay? Am I okay?" type of activities. And what we see now is the creation of Safety Check and how that's helping to connect friends and family to know if they're okay in areas of their loved ones being in an affected location. And this is really important because, whenever a disaster occurs, a very big one, everyone calls, and that clogs the phone lines. And that's why people can't make a phone call or even get through 911 maybe. There's a lot of different reasons, but this is why these other kinds of emerging technologies help fill that gap. Now, in November 2009, a colleague of mine who is also doing the same PhD program as me, who is now an associate professor at University of Washington, Kate Starbird had a really great idea, and she presented us at the first Random Hacks of Kindness. It was the first one. And her project was called Tweak the Tweet. And the idea of it was to take existing tweets that had useful information during a disaster and then put hashtags in front of each type of information so that it could be more machine readable. So if you had information on a certain need or offering and then a location, you put the hashtag LOC and then that location. The goal was to then be able to automatically pull this information from Twitter into a spreadsheet that then could be automatically put on a map to more immediately provide situational awareness. This is something I think we're now seeing more and more, is how do we take this unstructured data and make it more actionable? So in 2009 to 2010, I did a survey of all these different crisis map mashups that were starting to emerge in this Web 2.0 area. And what we found was a variety of maps, especially Google Maps, being used because they started to release their API and made it much easier to essentially update maps really quickly without having to have a lot of knowledge of GIS. And it provided real-time spatial and temporal updates during a disaster. There are also other great crisis map tools like this earthquake one where it combined this temporal time series. It was an open source tool and just made it easier to communicate the information and more interactive. And these are free tools, easy to use. I also like this one where it was a great way to take public data about sea level rise, put it on a map, and made it easier to communicate this information rather than it being in just a very long report, but really showing what the sea level would look like in certain locations on an interactive map. This led to a couple of different papers, but what I realized in conducting this survey was how important spatial temporal information was in creating them in these interactive maps and how it's becoming so easy for people to create these maps with these tools. And this concept of neogeography was kind of emerging in that. But it's that common operating picture of maps that really become important in providing that situational awareness. When January 2010 happened with the Haiti earthquake, that really created an important marker in this crisis mapping community. There's this product called Ushahidi that was really becoming an important use in the Haiti earthquake that Patrick Meyer helped steward. And then he helped develop, along with Jen Zemke, the Crisis Mappers Network. And this then evolved into the Digital Humanitarian Network, which is a network of networks of digital volunteers. And it's really grown, and that's how I met a lot of great people from government, academia, industry, all coming together to talk about these things. And one of the projects that was particularly impactful was the Haiti OpenStreetMap base map. And essentially, this was with the help of the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. They were able to leverage over 500 volunteer mappers, OpenStreetMappers, around the world from 29 countries, and basically provide 1.4 million edits on the base map in a very short period of time. They even got unclassified CIA maps and used that to map Haiti. Now, getting a base map is so important for disaster. This could even have been done before this earthquake occurred, but people want to help, and this was a really great example of how you could get a lot of people to help in a short period of time to provide something that was really important on the ground. So May 2011 came around, and I finally was able to finish my dissertation. It was an interdisciplinary dissertation called Grassroots Heritage, a multi-method investigation of how social media sustain the living heritage of historic crises. So I looked at 111 crises over the past 50 years, even before the web age, but seeing how these disasters were being communicated through social media, through Wikipedia, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. I think a lot of people always focus on Twitter to study because it's kind of easy to collect that data, but it's important to look at the whole ecosystem. And what I found was how these tools made it easier to, what I call, conduct socially distributed curation. Curation is a lot of different kinds of activities: collecting, editing, verifying, vetting that data, organizing it, telling it into a story or a way that it communicates the important piece of information you want to share, and preserving that and passing it on, keeping that memory alive of why we should remember these disasters. What can we learn? What protective action should we learn from these disasters? I finally finished that dissertation and had the opportunity to start a USGS Mendenhall postdoc fellowship. I first started at the National Earthquake Information Center in Golden, Colorado, then went to St. Petersburg, Florida at the Coastal Marine Science Center, and then I stayed at the National Center in Western Virginia, where I was able to turn my position into a position that did not exist, an innovation specialist. Wanted to share with you some of the examples. This is one that I did not work on, but a really well-established project that started in 1999. It actually started even before that with postcards. But it's called Did You Feel It? So if any of you feel an earthquake, go online, fill out our online form. Just provide your location and answer very simple questions like, did any furniture move? Did anything hanging move in any way? Very simple questions. And we've now been able to get 4.8 million Did You Feel It reports. This is around the world, as well as even in the US. You can see the coverage is pretty extensive. And what we do is we turn these Did You Feel It reports into community internet intensity maps. And then that information is actually fed into the Shake map, as well as Shakecast, as well as Pager. These are our authoritative USGS earthquake products that we share to all emergency responders, and it leverages crowdsourced data. It's important for providing the shaking intensity. We've been doing this for a long time, but there are many other federal agencies conducting similar work, and many of which are on citizenscience.gov. So I had the opportunity in 2012 to work on a project called Tweet Earthquake Dispatch. So this was a new project that Paul Earle had really innovatively thought about, is realizing that people are tweeting that they're feeling an earthquake. And so he wrote a really great article in the beginning of this work as OMG earthquake, because that's basically what people were tweeting. Now, the key is we don't want to tell people tweet when we're, during an earthquake. That could be a safety issue. But hopefully, what we were able to do was filter for the kinds of tweets that people were saying they were feeling an earthquake, not just talking about some earthquake. And 90% of our TED detections were faster than our seismic detections. Now, part of the reason why this might be is because there's some areas like the East Coast, like when the Mineral Virginia earthquake happened, where we don't have all these sensors and seismometers. So it's particularly important to know also earthquakes where it affects people, not where it just is in the middle of nowhere. So this was a really unique project that I think really points to why the currency is sometimes more important than the accuracy. In 2013, I also worked on a project called iCoast, Did the Coast Change? And essentially we had a scientist, Karen Morgan, who takes aerial photos of the coast before and after a storm from a window, or from a plane window. And the purpose of these photos, they've taken thousands of these photos now over the years, is to validate their prediction model of coastal erosion, of coastal change that happens to our barrier islands when extreme storms happen. And the goal was here to figure out how can we leverage the public to analyze these photos and help make sure our prediction models are accurate, as well as in the process, educate people about the coastal vulnerability that occurs. If you live on the barrier island, what will happen? And so I came to learn science terms that I didn't know. I didn't know what a dune scarp, I'm not sure if any of you do, but we created this tool where if you hover over these certain terms, it creates a pop-up box of an image and description and explains what these terms are. Since 2013, we have almost 2,000 users, over 660,000 tags that have been selected, over 70,000 classifications. We still have a lot of photos that's still yet to be classified, but we had an incredible amount of classifications that have happened because of what I call folks that have special abilities, people with autism, and happy to share more about that in the future. One other product that I created was in 2014 a crisis crowdsourcing framework. And essentially it explains how do you create your own project. And this is actually in the DHS Virtual Social Media Working Group paper on using social media for enhanced situational awareness and decision support. So when 2015, 2016 timeframe, this was when a lot of the federal community was starting to come together, and I eventually have become the co-chair of this federal community practice for crowdsourcing in citizen science. We developed citizenscience.gov. Also, we were able to contribute and help with the passing of the Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act of 2016. There's been a recent report around this. And I highly encourage you to check it out because this is encouraging federal agencies to actually leverage crowdsourcing. It's not actually telling people this is an issue. This is now something encouraged. And lastly, I just want to mention that the work I had recently done in 2017 started with what happened after Hurricane Harvey, and recognizing that people are using social media when 911 goes down, or providing other information out there. And so what we've been doing since 2017 with the help of my partner in crime here, Emily Marticello, and we were able to create this crowdsourcing unit. Now the first project that we had was basically the former administrator of FEMA asked, what's the status of 71 hospitals in Puerto Rico? So the official efforts we went to our digital volunteers, and basically the standby task force was able to provide faster, more, and different information and updates than the official efforts. Since 2017, we've done 6 different activations across different hurricanes, engaged in exercises. We've grown our crowdsourcing unit to 8 coordinators now. We've created a playbook, a toolkit. Check out crowdsourcem.org. I also had the opportunity to brief the acting DHS secretary, which is great to get this exposure to these politicals and recognize that these are important tools. And in addition to social media, it's important to realize that there's also private sector tools like Waze, GasBuddy, Google, Facebook data that we can leverage. So my key takeaways here for you is that members of the public are also first responders, on the ground as well as online. There's also been this growth of user-generated content because of social media and mobile devices. There's this active and passive kind of crowdsourcing that occurs. There's also something that I think Chris Vaughn had mentioned to me, which I think is really important. What is the acceptable risk or threshold for good enough accuracy? because sometimes currency is more important than accuracy. Also, digital volunteers curate information to create actionable intelligence by creating these maps. So we have some map journals. I'm happy to share more information about that, but that is really where we need to move this information to something more interactive. Also, think about the ethical responsibility of not only protecting privacy of PII, but also recognizing volunteers. We have citizen science projects where we actually put participant names in the authorship of journal articles. But also, since we know these systems like 911 goes down, it's our responsibility to recognize how do we also address the other ways people are reaching out for help. And then lastly, where I see the future of crowdsourcing is that it has been showing us how we can turn unstructured data into more machine-readable data that's critical for artificial intelligence types of applications.
Through the centuries and across the continents, one woman can make a difference. Across the ages and in every nation, one man can achieve great things. Now, hundreds, thousands, millions of individuals have the chance to work together to confront and solve the challenges of flood and famine, earthquakes and epidemics, and a changing climate. Today, the crowd can make history. For the first time, people can find like-minded others across their countries and around the world using cell phones and computers to span time and space. That's the cloud. I'm Waleed Abdulati, host of The Crowd in the Cloud. I've studied Earth's ice sheets from satellites and aircraft, and I was NASA chief scientist at the time Curiosity landed on Mars. So I know big data and big science, but I'm also convinced that citizen-generated data has an important role. In The Crowd in the Cloud, makers adapt off-the-shelf tools to help fill gaps left by official channels. Citizen scientists capture data about local air pollution and help change policy. In China, an environmental activist puts government data on a mobile app and invites citizens to report polluters. Every year at Christmas, thousands of bird watchers continue 100 years of observations. In Uganda, World Bank enumerators and local partners collect the numbers that will help farmers feed the young nation. No longer is science something only done in labs. No more is data only the property of corporations and governments. And these are just some of the stories you'll experience with me in The Crowd in the Cloud.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate listening to the past 15 years of my story and how I did not think outside the box. I just forgot about the box. So thank you. What I've learned in working at the National Response Coordination Center is how FEMA is a coordinating body, and they're in some ways crowdsourcing the effort of emergency management. It's amazing to be at the NRCC because it's all these different folks from across the government, as well as including more of an emphasis on the NBOC, working with the private sector, as well as the nonprofits that have been always there at the table, to realize that coordination is so important. And now there's an increasing need to recognize how do we leverage all this digital data. And so these digital volunteer networks are already and have been doing many of these disasters for at least a decade for across the world. Some of our volunteer groups like Standby Task Force, they are mostly from Europe. So when we have calls, they're in the Europe time zone. And I think it's actually really great to leverage these volunteers from around the world because they don't have to have these day-night shifts. I often do the night shift, but we can leverage folks around the world and leverage that time zone difference. So really, we are at a point right now where There is so much data. We can keep collecting a whole bunch of data. We often collect a lot of imagery, especially with things like UAS. But at this point, we need to leverage the human power of understanding this information and communicating it out. And maybe in some ways how that can help automate through machine learning. But I do think it's important that we leverage all different types of folks to help communicate this information, and especially these new kinds of data. The DHS Social Media Working Group actually has a paper that kind of looks at misinformation. So there's been efforts, and there's actually a lot of state, local level emergency management folks that have been already leveraging the use of social media and trying to understand issues like misinformation. Sometimes it's leveraging people who can mine all that information, whether it be manually through digital volunteers, but also using tools that help you automate some of this understanding. So we were kind of leveraging and testing out a tool called Data Miner First Alert, but there's a whole bunch of other kind of tools that can maybe mine all sorts of information that are online, not just Twitter or Facebook. And oftentimes these folks are using these tools to identify the misinformation. And it helps to then know where that's happening, when it's happening, and then be the authoritative voice to then start to combat that misinformation and leverage local key people in the community that can help spread that information. So we have a digital volunteer group called CEDR Digital Corps, CEDR being an acronym, and they have been able to find who, depending on the disaster and the location, who are the key local communicators, or the community leaders rather, that can be important folks that can help propagate information that's actually correct. So that's one piece. Sometimes finding very well-known, maybe famous people can also be helpful, but I think more importantly, this is about finding and understanding and adapting at that local level what is happening. How are people talking? They also look at 3 different languages that are predominantly spoken and try to think about that and recognize, what issues and what rumors come up. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. It's something that I recently looked at in terms of how do we combat the privacy information. I created an ethical geo video. It was a video challenge that recently came out to talk about some of these concerns. Now, this is not new. There were other previous disasters where people often realize people are looking for each other. Are you okay? Am I okay? And create these online tools. There was one that was recently created for Dorian, just specific to Dorian. And there's this balance of sharing personal information because it's the only way to know, is this the person that you're looking for? And is this the location that they need help? But also figuring out how do we protect that in an age where all this information is publicly available on purpose so that someone can find it, because 911 is not a place where it's working. It's a very difficult issue, but there are some folks really trying to figure out how do you still share the information but also protect it in some way. I think some information, we kind of assume what PII means, like your name and location, when a lot of that's already public. But I think we have to think about geospatially where I am and how I have Google Maps on all the time, so it knows where I park, it knows how long I spend in a store, which is called Google Busyness Data. And sometimes that could be really useful information, and sometimes it's a lot of information that I'm providing about where I go all the time. So I think we need to rethink PII, because name and location, or your name and your address, is not entirely as personal as other information that is constantly being collected from us, where we've already agreed to give it away through signing a terms of service agreement.